Hello, my name is Robert Pietzker and I'm happy to present our results on the impacts of tighter EU 2030 targets. The aim of this study is to provide an answer to the question, how difficult is it to achieve the 2030 targets? We look at required CO2 prices, which show the marginal mitigation costs. We also focus on the impact of how the additional emission reductions are split between the emissions trading system, ETS, on the one side, and the effort sharing regulation, ESR, on the other side. Our approach is a scenario-based analysis with numerical models, the Energy Economy Climate Model Remind EU and the Power Sector Industry Model LIMES EU. The scenarios we have span three dimensions: the reductions in 2030, how the additional reductions are split between ETS and effort sharing sectors, and the additional policy instruments, whether there are any or whether the targets achieved solely with a CO2 price. Let's have a look at our results, the marginal mitigation costs in 2030 in scenarios without additional policy instruments. For the current target of -40%, which has sub-targets of -30% against 2005 in the ESR sectors and -43% versus 2005 in the ETS sectors as defined by the EU Commission, we see CO2 prices of 150 to 250 euros in the ESR and 30 to 60 euros per ton CO2 in the ETS. Now, if we go to tighter targets, the question is, where do these additional reductions come from, the ESR sectors or the ETS sectors? We first look at a scenario where we assume that the additional reductions are split just like the current split. So if we go to -55% targets, we have these adjusted ESR and ETS targets, and they require CO2 prices of above 400 euros per ton CO2 for the ESR and around 100 euros per ton CO2 for the ETS. Now, if we put all the additional reductions in the ETS, then we see that the ETS target becomes a lot tighter, -79%, and this increases the required CO2 prices to 75 to 200 euros per ton CO2 in the ETS. Now, if we go to an even tighter target of -60%, we see that the difference between the ESR and ETS prices becomes even larger, so up to a factor of 5. However, if all the additional reductions are put in the ETS, we see that the CO2 prices become almost the same. Now, what is the effect of having additional policy instrument in the ESR sectors? We see that the required CO2 prices decrease substantially, roughly by a factor of 2. To summarize, if tighter 2030 targets are to be achieved purely with a price-based mechanism, then economic efficiency arguments speak in favor of putting most of the additional burden into the ETS, because this would make CO2 prices in the two systems equal. Secondly, we see that the required CO2 prices to achieve a certain target have a large uncertainty. And I would say this is a real-world uncertainty because there are a number of substantial uncertainties about, for example, the planning horizon of companies, how credible they think the transformation targets are, whether CCS will be available in most member states or not, how biomass imports develop, the speed at which craftsmen are retrained and new factories can be built, and also the question whether national policies are supporting or hindering the transformation. This brings me to the final point, that additional policies can substantially facilitate the transformation in the effort sharing regulation sectors and thereby decrease the required CO2 prices. Thank you.